Okay, so let's go through how this works. Okay, it's wild. It's kind of crazy. We'll go through how it works, and then we'll go through a critique or two of it. Okay, so there's lots of critiques of it, but the point here is that the interesting thing again is that if there's a firm with monopsony power, then raising the minimum wage will actually cause the firm to hire more workers, and we're still not even violating the law of demand, right? So it's a wild and crazy thing. So first, we need to remember that firms will hire until the marginal until the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal expense of labor. And that is, they want to keep hiring labor until the additional product or the additional profit that they're getting from one more unit of labor is exactly equal to the marginal expense, the expense they spend on that one more unit of labor. Okay, so in a case where there's no monopsony power, where the firm has a perfectly horizontal labor supply curve, right, the marginal expense of labor is very low. Okay, but in the case of an upward sloping supply curve, the marginal expense of labor is going to be much higher. And if the marginal expense of labor is higher, they're going to stop hiring labor at an earlier point. Remember, the marginal revenue product of labor is a decreasing function, right? So this is decreasing, and the marginal expense of labor is increasing, right? Or its first derivative is negative, first derivative is positive, whatever you want to, however you want to recall this or think about this, right? This is a decreasing function, this is an increasing function, okay? And if I raise this one higher, this one's going to be equal to it sooner, okay? And so what we see is this. Okay, so I'm going to try to draw this really carefully. Wage rate, quantity, and we have our demand for labor, which is derived from the marginal revenue product of labor, okay, and we have our supply of labor, which is derived from the marginal cost, I guess you could say, and then we have this curve, right, this figure here, and what this will do is it'll actually be somewhere up here. Okay, so this is the marginal expense of labor curve. Oops, right here. All right, and remember, right, this is effectively equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. Essentially, there's a slight difference, but not by much. So here, right, if the marginal expense of labor is equal to the wage rate, right, then the firm is going to hire, you know, where supply crosses demand, right? Standard thing. But in the case of a monopsony, they're going to stop hiring here, right? And what's more, just like when we had, you know, a monopoly where we had the marginal revenue curve, right? Remember, so we'll show you this real quick just in case you've forgotten it, right? We say that the monopoly will price up here, right, instead of at the perfectly competitive price. All right, remember this? Okay, so this is like the monopoly model. Monopsonies are able to price low, right? So they actually price very, very low. And so what the minimum wage would do, okay, so this is the standard source of every economist who says like raising the minimum wage. This is what they're talking about, okay? Any economist who understands you know, economics at sort of a deeper level, which you guys now do, right, can say that, well, if you have monopsony power, if there's a firm with a monopsony, right, with an upward sloping labor supply curve, so it doesn't even have to be a perfectly you know, perfect one seller, as long as it's costly or even just slightly annoying to find a new job. This is true, okay? And that's the crazy thing, Okay, so this is, under very, very simple assumptions, this is actually true. And so what it says is if we raise the minimum wage, okay, so if I mandate, let's say a minimum wage, so this is going to go down to here. If I mandate, let's say a minimum wage of here, right, what that will actually do is change the shape of the supply curve. Okay, so the supply curve will suddenly become kinked, right? And now, how the supply curve will look is, it'll be this portion here, and then it'll be this here. Okay, and so what the minimum wage effectively does is create a perfectly horizontal supply curve up until the point where it hits like the real supply curve here. Okay, and within that region, the marginal expense of labor, right, also becomes kinked, right? And so the marginal expense of labor will go from here, and then it'll jump discontinuously up to here, right? And so you end up with this weird looking graph that will, if I draw it, so let's see if I can draw it well. All right, so what it looks like, if I have wage and quantity, so you'll have the demand curve, and you'll have the kinked labor supply curve, and then you'll have, because this is horizontal here, right, the marginal expenditure curve, or the marginal expense of labor will be equal to the wage rate here, and then you'll have another function that just comes out up here, right, and this is marginal expense of labor and the supply, right? And so with the minimum wage, what it effectively does is it transforms the supply curve and the marginal expenditure curve. So this is, a discontinuous jump right here, right? It transforms the supply curve into a perfectly horizontal line, which is exactly going to be equal to the marginal expense of labor curve, right? Right here. This will all be marginal expense and supply are exactly equal right here. And so what happens, right, is that firms increase their hiring of labor. So before they were hiring Q1, now they're hiring Q2. Okay, and so this is like the crazy result. This is where any economist that says, raising the minimum wage, this is where any economist who says that raising the minimum wage will actually increase employment, this is where they're getting it, right? It's right here. Okay, now this analysis is still incomplete. Okay, and so I want you guys to look at some of the things I put on Blackboard by a guy named Robert Murphy and a few other things, right? And see if you can figure out what's going on, right? So Robert Murphy has a great article up there that I've linked to, and he's very smart. He's a very smart man. I agree with everything that he says, right? That he says about low skill labor and substitutes, etc. Right? I totally agree. But for now, set that aside, because there is one other thing that even Bob Murphy glosses over, right? And I think it's the more prescient, the more damning critique of this analysis, okay? But for now, set that aside, see if you can figure out what it is, okay? Tell you what, I'm going to put, that's going to be one of the questions on your exam this week, is to figure out what the damning thing is. And I give you a hint in the lecture notes, okay? So take a look and let me know if you have any questions.